The text for our meditation this morning comes from Psalm 126, verses 1 and 2. When the Lord brought back the captives to Zion, we were like men who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. So far our text. In the name of Jesus, dear Christian friends, when I was my daughter Naomi's age, I saw a poster that changed my life. The poster was hanging in a hallway in the second floor of Flint Central High School, right outside the German classroom. And it was typically Schwarz, Rot und Gold, black, red, and gold of the German flag. And it was advertising a scholarship program, a competition put on by the United States Congress and the West German Bundestag. And anyone who qualified and made it through was allowed to go at the cost of those nations for a year of exchange overseas. And I thought to myself, now that's something that would be fun to do. That's how I ended up in West Germany in the fall of 1989 in a high school, a gymnasium in 12th grade, sitting in a history class. I don't know why history was one of my two majors when I was in Germany, but 1989 was a good time to be studying history in West Germany. The class was made up of all kinds of colorful characters, but two that stick out the most are the teacher and then a particular student that the teacher always had a problem with. And that tension, that conflict kind of ran throughout the whole year. The history teacher's name was Herr Kühl, but he was anything but cool. I mean, he kind of had one of those bowl cuts and sandy dishwater blonde hair. He wore those big, remember the 1980s big glasses that went above his eyebrows and below his cheekbones? He wore this full-length trench coat, even in the spring and in the late fall. And when he entered the room, he looked like the guy from Seinfeld. You know, when he entered, he just kind of Kramered it into the room. The guy he always had trouble with wasn't a particular friend of mine. He was just one of the other students, barely an acquaintance, really. But his name was Günther, and Günther was the opposite of Herr Kühl. Günther was tall, and his blonde hair was tight curls. He had that white alabaster skin that was so white that even if he got a little upset or a little angry or had even half a glass of beer, the blotches would come out, and they'd be watermelon bright red. I remember Herr Kühl and Gunnar would go round and round in our history class because Gunnar was one of those guys that had high hopes for the German nation, for German reunification, maybe even someday, he wasn't a skinhead or anything like that, but he was progressive and right-leaning, and he thought the best years of the German nation were ahead, and he had a love and a hope for the German nation that, quite honestly, someone like Herr Kühl, whose parents and grandparents would have served under a Nazi regime, just couldn't have at that point in history. And I remember the argument came to a head in the late October of 1989 because we were getting ready to go on a field trip as a class to Berlin as a part of our history class. And I remember the argument coming up. Günther was excited about the things going on in Eastern Europe. And I remember Herr Kühl slamming his hand on the desk and saying, "The wall will not come down in our lifetime." End of discussion. That was October of 1989. We went to Berlin. We had to travel from West Berlin to East Berlin. We went through Checkpoint Charlie. And there, not only the East German guards in their kind of lime green uniforms. Who chooses lime green for uniforms? These lime green uniforms with a hammer and a sickle on them. And behind them, the dark blue and gray of the Russian soldiers with the red star on their helmets. They'd check your passports with submachine guns in their hands. We went into East Berlin and had a really wonderful day. The history museum there, the Egyptian history exhibit was unbelievable. We saw the Linden Street and the Brandenburg Gate, got to see the radio tower in the marketplace. But later that day, or perhaps it was the next, we were walking downtown. We'd come back to the west side, and we had to walk through the city along the wall part of the way. And Herr Kühl said to the whole class, perhaps especially to Gunnar, I don't want any monkey business. Don't throw anything at the wall. Don't get too close to the wall. Whatever you do, don't pretend like you're climbing up on the wall. I don't want anybody shot on my watch. And the automatic weapons and the Russian and East German soldiers convinced even Gunnar that maybe it was a good idea to stay away from the wall. Late October 1989. Events, of course, in world history took a sudden change just less than a month later. November 11th, 1989 was reported on American television something like this.
Good evening, everyone. From the west side of the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburg Gate, I'm Tom Brokaw. The Brandenburg Gate, of course, is in East Berlin, and the sound that you hear and what you're seeing tonight, not hammers and sickles, but hammers and chisels as young people take down this wall bit by bit. Earlier this evening, the Communist Central Committee in East Berlin proposed an action program, including free elections and a democratic coalition government. Tonight, citizens from both Germanys are singing and dancing on the wall itself, reunited right on top of that harsh symbol of division. Thousands of East Berliners have been pouring into West Berlin since the borders were open, and tonight in this city, famous for its carefree nightlife, in this city where the song says, life is a cabaret, tonight in Berlin, it is Freedom Night.
I remember that night. I was just a couple hours drive to the west of that in North Germany at the time. And Gunnar and a bunch of his friends got in a car, and they didn't care their school next day. They drove out to Berlin, and they were up on the wall, and they joined the party. It was like a New Year's Eve celebration, the best one you've ever experienced, but in the middle of November. And nobody could believe what was happening. That Bible verse from Psalm 126, that's what it reminded me of. When the Lord brought back the captives from Zion, we were like men who dreamed. People are walking around in a daze. They couldn't believe this was happening and happening so quickly. Of course, I stayed at home, and I went to school the next day. And of course, Herr Kuh was there too. And the two of us and maybe 3 or 4 other people had history class that morning. And nobody mentioned his prediction that the wall wouldn't come down in our lifetime. I didn't go back to Berlin in November, but I did get to go back as a part of the Congress Bundestag exchange. I got to go back to Berlin in March. And in March, remember in October, late October, I'd been told, don't get too close to the wall, you might get shot. And in March, this is what I found. That's me. And those are very American pants. I think they're Bugle Boys. But the shoes are German, and the jacket's German, and that's a pretty German Justin up there. That's a Brandenburg Gate behind me. You can't see it because it's behind me, but at that time, did you know this? Once the Russians occupied Berlin, they took the horses on top of the Brandenburg Gate and faced their hindquarters towards the west. They've been since turned back around. But if you could see them, the hindquarters are just over my left shoulder, and that's the East German flag flying from the Brandenburg Gate, and that's the Berlin Wall I'm standing on. I even got to take a piece of it home with me. Very simple piece of concrete, rough to the touch. Nothing really special about it. It's got a little hint of spray paint from all the graffiti. It's a piece of history. There was a part of that I touched, that I lived through, that changed my life, that caught me up in ways that were hard to explain and are even hard to express. There's another picture like that of me on the wall going like this. And that summed it up. We couldn't believe what was happening around us. I was recently asked in a book of all places to think of a story in my life that could be used as a parable, a story from my personal history that might have something to tell me about Jesus. And I liked that exercise because of our mission statement, the one we've been kind of growing into, seeking everyone's story, sharing in his story. So this gives me a chance to share with you a story, a piece of a story that was important and formative to me, and you get to know me better, and I get to know you better, and we get to share each other's stories. But it also has a chance of helping us understand Jesus better, too. I thought it was a little bit ridiculous to think that perhaps something in my personal history could be a parable to help understand Jesus better. But as soon as I prayed the prayer, Lord, is there something that you would have me, immediately I thought of standing on the wall there in Berlin. And I thought I was going to preach a sermon on the epistle lesson today, how God tears down the walls of division. But the more I sat with it, the more I pondered it, the more I prayed over it, I thought, it's not like the East and West Germans were the Jews and Samaritans. That's not really the theme. In fact, I think about that differently 28 years later than I did at the time. If you'd asked me at the time, I would have said, Herr Kuhl was just out to lunch, a history prof that didn't know any better. And Gunnar, although he was kind of a jerk, was a pretty smart guy. I think now I would say, I'd say something differently. But only because I've gotten to know someone else's story just a little bit. It showed up on the radio of all places, and in a couple of books. It just started popping up while I was praying and thinking about the sermon. It's something called the Stockdale paradox. It's named after a guy, Vice Admiral James Bond Stockdale. This is him. And you might remember Vice Admiral Stockdale as being Ross Perot's running mate. He was the vice presidential guy in 1992. But before that, back in 1965, James Stockdale was the senior ranking naval officer in what was known as the Hanoi Hilton, a prison camp, a work camp, a POW camp. And he spent 7 years in that POW camp. 4 of those years he spent in solitary confinement. 2 of them he had irons on his legs. He was physically tortured more than 15 times because they knew if they could break the highest ranking official, they could break others as well. Not too long before he died, Vice Admiral Stockdale was interviewed for a business leadership book called Good to Great. And he was asked, what happened to all those other people, the people that didn't endure even 2 or 3 years? What happened to the people that didn't make it out of the POW camp? Who were those people? And Stockdale said, those people, the people that didn't make it out, the people that couldn't make it through that difficult time, they were the optimists. They were the ones that said, we'll be out by Christmas. And then Christmas came and went. And they said, we'll be out by Easter, and Easter came and went. And then they said, we'll be out by Thanksgiving, and it was Thanksgiving, and then Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart. Stockdale said, you had to be willing to trust and know that you were going to make it out. But you also had to face what was right in front of you. That became known as the Stockdale paradox. It's formulated this way. Stockdale said, you must retain faith that you will prevail in the end regardless of the difficulties. And you must confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they may be. You've got to trust that you will prevail and not hide your head in the sand. Face the brutal facts that you have right in front of you. And do both those same things at the same time. It reminds me actually of the gospel lesson for today. In those late chapters of Matthew, Jesus is teaching his disciples before he goes to the cross and ascends to heaven. Jesus is teaching his disciples, and not even biblical scholars can agree exactly when he's talking about exactly what, but it's fairly clear he's talking about 2 different things in that same chapter. He's talking about the imminent destruction of Jerusalem, where not just the walls coming down, but the temple and every major building is brought low by the Romans. That historically happens in 70 AD, and Jesus is talking about an imminent judgment on the city and the temple. But he's also talking at the same time in the same chapter about the end times when Jesus comes again and final judgment is upon us. And Jesus says, the one who endures to the end will be saved. The one who endures to the end will be saved. He tells his followers straight up, it's going to be hard. People are going to hate you. People are going to revile you. People are going to throw you in prison and even kill you because of my name. But he also says, you're going to endure. And the one who endures to the end will be saved. I think Jesus might approve the Stockdale paradox. You got to trust that you're going to endure, that you're going to prevail in the end, and at the same time you have to face the brutal realities you have in front of you, both and at the same time. So, as uncool as I thought cool was, I think he did it right. I think if Kul had been in daily contact with Comrade Gorbachev and President Reagan, he should have still told his history class what he told them. Because in late October, you would have got shot if you climbed on the wall. It wasn't until November 11th that history changed. And when it changed quickly. Maybe Gunnar and Kul together had the truth. Because Gunnar was all about one day we're going to prevail. And Kul was all about we got to face the brutal reality of what's in front of us. So for followers of Jesus, I guess I would reframe the Stockdale paradox just a little bit for our usage. Put an asterisk behind it. You could maybe say it this way. You must retain faith that Jesus will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties. And you must bring the most brutal facts of your current reality to Jesus, whatever they may be. You got to trust that Jesus' promises are sure and that he will prevail even when you can't see it and it feels like he's far away from you, and you can't stick your hand in the head in the sand. You can't stick your head in the sand and be some kind of Pollyanna pie-in-the-sky Christian who everything will work out just fine. You trust Jesus and you face the brutal reality that Jesus faces with you. And what I'd like to ask you to do here as we finish this time together, I'd like you to talk to somebody next to you and just let them know. Think about this. Which sides of which side of that paradox do you think you have the most trouble with? Which one is harder for you? To trust that Jesus will prevail or to face the brutal facts of your current reality with Jesus by your side? Which of those two is more difficult for? If you're not sitting right by somebody, kind of snuggle up to somebody, but you got just a couple of minutes to talk about that. Share which side of the paradox is harder for you, to trust that Jesus will prevail or to face the brutal reality of your week. Ready, get set, go. If you're one of the people that has more trouble retaining faith that Jesus will prevail in the end, then I've got a promise I'd like to speak to you. By the power of your baptism, you are joined to the death and therefore the resurrection and also the return of Jesus. Your story belongs to his story, so you know how the story's going to end. I point you to a guy who really struggled with what was right in front of him, the Old Testament man Job, who lost everything he had, family, life, riches, friends, and he couldn't understand what was right in front of him. And yet, Job was able to say, I know that my Redeemer lives, and on the end he will stand upon the earth. And even though my skin be thus destroyed, yet in my flesh will I see God, I and not another. How my heart burns within me. If you have got trouble sometimes clinging to the promise, that's natural. It's not an easy promise to cling to, but know this. God who is faithful will do it. Jesus will prevail. And if you're one of the people that has a little bit more trouble focusing on the second side of the paradox, facing the brutal facts of your current reality with Jesus at your side, I want you to know there's nothing you face this week that you face alone. There's no difficulty, there's no struggle, there's no failure, there's no sin. There's nothing that you have to face this week that you face without the presence of Jesus, who before he was taken up into heaven said, look, I'm with you always, every step of the way. And I would point you to Martha, the sister of Lazarus, who in the presence of Jesus said, I know my brother will rise in the last day, Jesus, when you prevail in the end, I know my brother will someday rise. And Jesus' response to Martha was this, oh Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Already here, already now, the power of my presence means your life is changed. The future victory of Jesus is breaking into your present in real, tangible ways. Jesus wept at the tombside of Lazarus before he raised him from the dead because Jesus knows what you're going through. And there's nothing you face this week that you don't face with him. Just a rough piece of concrete no value at all, except the value that came by it being a part of a bigger story. That's your life. That's my life too. Sometimes a little rough to the touch, sometimes a little hard-headed or hard-hearted, sometimes a little rough around the edges, maybe a little bit of spray paint to give you some color. But ultimately, your life has meaning because it's tied into a bigger story, the story of Jesus. And he will prevail in the end. And he's with you every step of the way. Amen.